All right, well, let's see who remembers anything. Oh, Peloponnesian War. What should come to mind? Civil War. And what's the result? Death, carnage, bloodshed, all that. What result that's important to world history?
The destruction of the Greek city-states. They're taken over by the Macedonians.
Okay, it paved the way for the Macedonians, Philip and Macedon, to take over because they did not work together anymore from the Civil War. Which Punic War involved Hannibal? Second. Which civil war led to the death of Cleopatra? Got a 1 in 3 shot at it. Zach? Third Civil War. What does Mare Nostrum mean? That's a Latin phrase. Jasmine wants to answer. Tied in with the year 100 BC. Are you still trying or are you giving up? Giving up. Tamar? Our Sea is what it was referring to the Mediterranean. It was Roman Sea, our Sea. How did the tributes that began to come from Carthage in the Punic Wars hurt? In fact, the same tribute comes from other places, and it continues to do the same thing. Yes? Okay, the Roman farmers couldn't compete with this free grain, especially after having been gone for 15 years or so, which led to them having a lot of them losing their farms. It leads to large groups, large numbers of unemployed people living on welfare, which also probably meant, like today, that there were large groups, not just a number. So, all right. Who was the first emperor of the Roman Empire? In world history last class, Rachel McNabb pulled this name out. We were talking about something else. She said, "Oh, it wasn't that," and she threw his name out. I was impressed, Justin. No, not Octagon. Octavian. Octavian was his name. He's the Caesar Augustus in the Bible. At the birth of Christ, he's the first of the emperors. All right, hopefully everybody has 100. Entire average for the semester, right there. So, okay, we will continue on. The next thing we have is a test. Couple class periods off, so we'll think about that. We got 2 class periods next week, and then no class on Monday, and then the test that next Thursday, I think, is the order. So, coming fast.
Are we doing our Monday classes on Wednesday, or just no classes at all?
No classes at all. Unless I've got it wrong. I don't think there's any classes at all. So, that's why I didn't feel guilty asking you guys all to come in and work. I'm not taking a day off. All right, let's continue on looking at some of the emperors under the empire. I know we talked about Octavian, and then I think we talked about the Claudian emperors. Tiberius, he was the emperor during Christ's earthly reign and his death. And then we talked about Nero. Someone tell me something about Nero. Caleb?
Very nice.
Very nice. Okay, yes, he's a very nice man. Miles? First wave of persecution, yes. What was his chicken's name? Completely insignificant to world history, but I did mention it. Roma, all right, that he thought the chicken had died. So, all right, so that's the Claudian emperors. The next group of emperors is called the Flavian emperors. I'll just mention a couple of things about these guys. If you want some years, the Claudian emperors are 14 to 68. I might have given you that. Flavian are 68 to 96. Yes. What? Oh, Flavian, Flavian. Flavian.
What was the date for the Claudian?
14 to 68. Now these are all AD. And then 68 to 96 for the Flavian. Yes. Just two things to mention for the Flavians. First one is they were the emperors of Rome when Jerusalem is conquered and destroyed in 70. I'm sure you all had that in your mind when you saw 68. You said, oh, right before the destruction of Rome in 70. But they were the ones in charge of that when the temple gets destroyed. If you ever get a chance to go to Rome, go to Rome, but also go to Jerusalem, and you can see this destruction. They've excavated down beside the temple, and you can to the streets at this time, and you can see where the stones had been thrown down onto the street. And, they've cleaned all the dirt out, and you can see them still sitting there from this destruction in 70. But anyway, they were the emperors for that destruction. And it was also during these Flavian emperors that we get a second wave of persecution. If you want the guy's name, the emperor was Domitian. He exiled John to Patmos, among other things. There's eventually 10 waves of persecution through here. We won't make note of all of them, but that was the second one there, the Flavian emperors. Okay, the next group of emperors is called the 5 good emperors. Can anybody guess how many? 6. Lots of times you'd be right. In this case, there are actually 5 of them. 5 good, not in the sense that they were righteous and holy and served God, but they were capable rulers, and we see Rome expanding geographically, expanding in military might and power. So 5 good in that sense. The fourth one, there's two of these guys persecute the Christians. So it's not like they were good, holy people, but they were good rulers. So 5 good rulers. Just a couple of comments about them. The first one is underneath these emperors, we see the empire reach its height. The boundaries you see up there come under these guys. So the largest geographic size, the strongest militarily, just the height, pretty much any way you want to think about it, is reached under these guys. The one particular ruler that brings it to its greatest geographic size was a guy named Trajan, Trajan. He's the second in this line. So that right there is the extent that he pushed it to. The Romans were amazing for lots of things, but they built so much stuff.
Why were the Romans never able to take over Mesopotamia? I know I haven't agreed they were good, so why weren't the Romans?
Mostly it was these people right here, the Parthians. They go back and forth multiple times at war with the Parthians. And neither one is really able to get the upper hand. The Parthians, make sure you get it straight. The Parthians were very good fighting out in open, but very good at laying siege to cities. So they would defeat the Romans in a battle, and the Romans would fall back to their cities, and the Parthians couldn't take the city. So they goes back and forth. Sometimes the one of the Parthian capitals was this city right here. How do you say that? And it goes from Roman hands to Parthian hands. It goes back. But that really is, they can never conquer them. So
They're the ones who developed the bow and cavalry archers.
they did use them extensively. I don't know if they were the first to develop it. I don't know. They had a very, very good military. So I don't know if they're the first.
They're where we get to saying a parting shot from, correct?
A parting shot?
Yeah. Their tactic was to charge forward, get close to retreat, firing over their shoulder.
Okay. I'm not familiar with that. She agrees with you, so it must be right. So. But anyway, that was really the Parthians stopped them there to the east. Wow, you're the first to ever ask about Parthia in this class. So, in world history, we talk about Rome and Parthia, and the Parthians going at it some. So. Okay, 5 good emperors, 5 of them. I didn't give you the years for them. I don't think 97 to 180. So somebody tell me something of significance here about the the Roman Empire at this point. 180. We saw that year already come up. If you look under Octavian, you might have it there. Joanne? Yeah, the Pax Romana. That goes from 30 BC to 180. When the 5 good emperors passed, after the 5th one, it's the end of that Roman peace. From this point on, there begins to be turmoil and problems inside the empire.
Under which heading is Vespasian? Is he a Flavian emperor or one of the 5 emperors?
Vespasian was, I think he's one of the 5. 1, 2, 3, 4, but I don't have him listed there. No? So it must have been a Flavian. Nerva, Trajan, Hadrian, Antonius, Pius, and Marcus Aurelius were the 5 good, and I don't have all the other ones listed for the others, but I think it'd be Flavian. So, all right, where were we? All right, with the end of the 5 good emperors, that marks the end of that Pax Romana time frame. I really don't have that delineated. I don't have the Pax Romana emperors in my notes, but just for this is the end. It might be obvious with the name of the next group of emperors. They ruled for about 100 years, 100 to 180 to 284, and they're called the barracks emperors, not the barracksins emperors, but the barracks as in military barracks where the soldiers sleep, the barracks emperors. And this was a series in this 100 years of 28 different kings, all coming to power through the military. They would rise up, gain power as a general, and then they would kill off the other king, and they would rule for a couple of years, and then they would get killed off. So there was this turmoil through this whole time frame. There was a couple of them that ruled actually for a little bit of time, but just if you take 100 years, 104 years, and divide 28 into it, we're in at 3 to 4 years on average for each of these guys. 100 to 284.
100?
I'm sorry, wow. 180 to 284. I got 100 years stuck in my head. 180 to 284, roughly 100 years. So only one of these guys died of natural causes. The other 27 get killed by the next guy that came in. So the barracks emperors. My last point I have for this, and there's some examples underneath this, is that under the barracks emperors, we see this Roman Empire beginning to crumble. We saw it reach its height of power, geographic size, under the 5 good emperors and the Pax Romana. Now as we get out of that time frame, there begins to be some serious weakness here. And I just have a list of some types of things that began to happen. Sounds like today, a lot of these taxes were raised. They actually started letting all kinds of people become citizens so they could tax them. Maybe we should do that. Would help the immigration problem. Taxes were raised. Inflation was very high. There were even times where Rome refused to accept their own money in payment. When countries paying tribute to them, they had to come up with some other country's currency and pay with it. So inflation was bad. The government was in debt. Barbarians begin to invade. The barbarians were always there, all right? These nasty Germans up here, okay? Anybody German? Fitz. Jacob is the most authentically German. His mom grew up in Germany. At some point, I have some German roots with Reinhardt. It's way back somewhere. But anyway, these barbarian hordes, they were constantly throwing themselves against the empire, trying to invade. But during that Pax Romana and all that time frame, Rome was able to hold them out. Now they begin to be successful. They begin to make inroads, and they would drive in and actually take back territory and conquer Roman cities. So these barbarians begin to be successful. They had always been there, but they begin to be successful. So, okay, the point is, we see the empire beginning to weaken. All right, it still lasts. I'm sure you all know the final end. Have that date in your mind from the timeline. You've been studying it at night. When's it end? 476. So there's still a little bit of time left for the empire to exist, but we see it definitely beginning to weaken here. All right, so that's the barracks emperors. We are not going to go through all 28 of those. We're going to leave it right there. Let's jump ahead to the next ruler. We're going to just actually look at two more rulers with any detail at all. The next ruler is a man named Diocletian. Yes, Diocletian, Diocletian. Diocletian. He rules from 284 to 305. So you could in one sense say he was the last of the barracks emperors, because he comes to power through the army. He actually was born just a common man, gets in the military, rises through the ranks, becomes general, and then bumps off the previous guy. So in one sense, he's one of the barracks emperors, but he rules for 21 years, and actually makes some changes here that stems the tide a little bit of the chaos that was ensuing. So Diocletian. All right, the first thing I have for him, and it's kind of a summary of all of it, and we'll give you some details, is that he made some political reforms that held this empire together for nearly 200 more years. You can think of it as we once had a pump with a gas engine on it, and the housing cracked where the impeller is. Sorry if this is boring to you, a bad example. And Mr. Leslie took some sort of JB weld or something and put it on the crack, and took some metal straps, and he strapped the thing together, and it worked. It looked really, really ugly, but it worked. All right, so he kind of straps the empire together. There's still that major crack in it and that weakness and flaws there, but he manages to strap it together, and it lasts for a little bit longer. So, all right, a couple of details about these reforms that he made. All right, first of all, he split the empire up into two different pieces, an eastern and a western side. Eastern and a western side. He actually ruled directly the eastern side, this half. His capital was actually in Turkey and Asia Minor there. The western half was ruled by somebody else, and I don't know if I have the name here. Maximian ruled the other half. And he actually didn't even rule from Rome. He ruled from Milan in Italy. So splits it up into two pieces so that each of these guys had less area to look at and think about. They still had massive amounts of territory. Say, I've only got half of the Mediterranean region to deal with. Still a whole lot. But splits it up that way, and each one trying to run and control their own side, not separate at all, not a separate empire, but two different pieces as far as the government structure and administration went. So he does that. If you want to make note of it, he makes other changes in the structure further down the line, reorganizes kind of the whole chain of command of how the local governors, who they report to, and it organizes that whole system, makes it more efficient and more successful. So, all right, another thing he does successfully is stop the barbarians. We saw them successfully invading and taking territory. So stops the barbarians. And then does a couple of things that really don't contribute to making the empire live longer, but I think they're worth noting. There was inflation we saw during the barracks emperors, and it's still going on here. He tried something that never ever works. All right, he tried price and wage controls. And when you hear politicians bring up this idea today, I mean, you can say, wait a second. 1,800 years ago, we tried this and it didn't work. It's never worked. The thinking is, the problem with inflation is that prices just keep going up, and employers keep raising the wages of their employees because prices are going up. We have those kind of chasing each other. So he said, well, let's just freeze it. Nobody can raise their prices, nobody can raise their wages. Freeze the two. Okay, anytime you have that type of government intervention into the economy, you get problems. Usually the inflation is the result of some other dumb government policy, and the solution is more dumb government policy. It'd be like smashing your thumb with a hammer and saying, wow, that really hurt. Let's make it quit hurting. So you stick out your index finger and smash it, and then you don't notice your thumb quite as bad. Right? Really, it never, ever works. All right, never, ever works. But he did try to impose these price and wage controls to stop the inflation, and it just led to an economic depression, which is typically what happens. So, all right, one other thing with Diocletian is he is also responsible for the last wave of persecution, the worst and the last wave of persecution underneath him. Okay, then we get to a ruler who ruled from 305 to 337. Those numbers should sound familiar. At least there's a number in there that should sound familiar to you by the test. 305 to 337. There's a date that falls in between there. You know it? Or are you just saying, yes, there is one? Jacob agrees with me. He's not willing to look, or maybe he doesn't have it with him. So, Matthew. Constantine, right? He's the one that made Christianity legal. Diocletian was the prior ruler. He's the last to really persecute the Christians. And then we get Constantine, 305 to 337. He's referred to as the first of the Christian emperors. And that's a very loose usage of the word Christian, right? It'd be like saying that the Pope is a Christian. All right, I mean, that's to the, I guess, broader world, we're all just kind of the same Christians, and we know very differently. So anyway, he's referred to as a Christian, but much more of a Catholic-type Christian if we're going to use that designation at all. So, all right, a couple of things about Constantine. He becomes ruler in 305. We already have that. In time, he combines both sides under his control for a short time. After his death, it splits back apart. But he becomes the sole ruler for a short time. All right. He also has a vision in 331, which we talked about before. He's heading towards a battle, a military campaign, has this vision at night. It was after one of those Roman feasts that they were famous for late at night, and it was just indigestion waking him up. But has this vision at night, sees this cross, and it says, "In this sign, conquer." So it's got the sign of the cross there, the Christian symbol. The next day, he wins this great victory and becomes a Christian. Probably your conversion involved a vision at night, and I hope not. Don't tell me about it. But anyway, that was 331. He has this vision, wins this victory, and then makes Christianity legal. The actual document that he issues to make Christianity legal is called the Edict of Milan, M-I-L-A-N.
What date did you say you wanted out?
331. Isn't that the date we have? Oh, you know what? It's 313. I have 313 written here and thought I had it wrong. 313, sorry. .313. Edict of Milan. Milan was the capital city that they'd moved to in Rome, so that's where it came from.
Can you spell that again?
Milan, or M-I-L-A-N. Yeah. Okay, one other thing to mention with him is that in time, as the sole ruler of the empire, he moves the capital to the city of Byzantium and renames it. Anybody know? Constantinople. Yeah, anybody know what it's named today? It's not known by either name. So, Istanbul. Okay, so he moves it to Byzantium. It was a Greek colony originally. He renames it Constantinople, and then about, 1,200 years later, the Muslims beat everybody up there and call it Istanbul. So, I would love to go there someday. Not because of the Muslims, but to see the giant church that he built and some other things. So there's lots of places I'd love to go, but that is on the list. So moves the capital to there, Byzantium. He renames it Constantinople. Okay, so Constantine. All right, the next thing I have here in our history of Rome, for me, the last main point was the Roman Empire. The next main point here is the fall of the Western Roman Empire. Now there's a point here that I have not really focused on too much. The fall of the Western Roman Empire. After Constantine, the empire gets split up again into those two halves. And when we talk about the fall of Rome, it is really just the western half that we're talking about. All right, this western side, kind of draw a line through here. This whole western side falls to these nasty German invaders and others. The eastern side survives. All right, it gets its own separate name, and it's there for another 1,000 years after the western half collapses. Anybody know what that side becomes? Just two? Yeah, the Byzantine Empire. It's there for 1,000 years, literally 1,000 years. It's 14, I forget the date, when the Muslims finally conquer them. Okay, so the collapse of the Western Roman Empire here in 476. We're talking about this half collapsing. It would be most of what we think of as Western Europe that's affected here, that half. The other side is really a very, very different history. So, okay, the collapse of the western side of the Roman Empire. We know the date here is 476. The story really is fairly simple. It wouldn't have been fun to live through. But basically what happened is those barbarians just keep becoming more and more successful. They drive further in. They take more territory. The Roman emperors on that western side get weaker. Eventually, the barbarians take Rome. Actually, that was in 410. They conquer the city of Rome, and then Rome recovers somewhat and continues to exist for a while. So we have these barbarians continuing to conquer and drive deeper. And let me give you a couple of names here. One group is the Visigoths, Visigoths. Visigoths. Yeah, Visigoths. The particular leader that's most well known is a man named Alaric, Alaric. They give Rome, it's always described as their worst defeat ever, which had to be pretty good thumping if you think of what Hannibal did to them a couple times. This particular battle, the emperor himself was killed on the battlefield. I mean, it was a very ugly battle. But anyway, Visigoths there with Alaric. It was actually them in 410 that conquer the city of Rome, and they pillage it, and eventually the Romans recover the city, but they take it. So another group comes in that actually hates everybody. The Huns, Attila the Hun. This has been about this same time. We have the Visigoths driving into the Roman Empire. The Huns sweep into Europe. And for a little bit of time, the Visigoths and the Romans worked together because they both hated the Huns. There's a big battle in 451 against the Huns. We have them coming in. So anyway, that it's this constant invasion by these barbarians. And it's funny. The barbarians is always the other people. Right? It'd be fun to read the story sometime of, we're the barbarians. We're wanting to kill the civilized people. We don't read that too often, but the barbarians are the other people. So we have these barbarians continuing to invade and drive deeper, deeper, deeper. Finally, in 476, it's actually not a big battle that takes place or anything. 476, the last emperor was just removed from the throne. The German chieftain came in and said, "You're no longer the emperor." And by that point, really, there wasn't much to fight over. But 476, that was the final end. The last emperor gets removed from power by one of those German chieftains. So, 476. Okay, 3 more things here to look at quickly before we leave Rome. The first one is that the fall of Rome, the fall of this western side of Rome, was devastating to Western Europe. We talk about the Dark Ages, and this is marks the beginning of the Dark Ages. There's a lot of truth to that. What you think about when you think of the Dark Ages. It was a very dark time in Western European history. Eastern Europe has a different history with the Byzantines, but the Western Europe, very, very dark time. All right, just a kind of a list in here of how this was devastating. So, first of all, the government structure basically disappeared. It was just complete anarchy. The barbarians were successful in destroying Rome and all of its structure, but they never really set something up to replace it. All right, so we just have basic anarchy. We have the infrastructure completely fallen apart. It would take a little bit of time, but not too long. Imagine if we didn't have a government to organize the road construction. But government and organized do not ever go together, so I'm not sure what word we would use there. But imagine if we never maintained our roads. It wouldn't take that long till the highways would be impassable. And so we had that same type of thing happen here. Rome, they built roads and things all over. They were great, great builders. There are bridges that they built that cars go across today, which to me is amazing. They weren't thinking about vehicles that heavy, but they're still used today, some of these things. But the highways and bridges and things fell into disrepair, so travel became very, very difficult. So trade basically completely stopped. Think about how bad your life would be if you couldn't have things shipped from China through Amazon. What would you do? But really, it wasn't safe to travel. Lots of places it wasn't really practical to travel unless you were doing some sort of mountain climbing through the ravines that used to have a bridge across them. It wasn't practical, wasn't safe. There wasn't there wasn't a police force. There wasn't an army to protect you. So trade ceased. Learning disappeared. All right, just not completely disappeared. There were pockets of learning. But for the most part, it was a very, very ignorant time. One of the important services, if that's the way to say it, that the Byzantines played is that during all this time where the Western Europeans, make up all these stories and legends about black cats and, this time of great ignorance, we have the Byzantine Empire preserving all the knowledge of the Greeks and the Romans and their writings and things like that. So they play a very important role of bringing that knowledge forward. But really, a time of great ignorance here for Western Europe. Again, there were exceptions. You can read writers from this time frame, and a lot of them come out of the monasteries and places like that. But the common people, extremely, extremely ignorant. I don't have this here, but at one point in France, the life expectancy was 37 years or something like that. You hear people talk about, man, back in the good old days where people ate real food. Give me some GMOs, right? I don't want to die at 37. I would be dead already if you're wondering. I don't want to die at 37. But it was a very, very dark time. So I once watched a lecture, a guy trying to describe how it wasn't a dark time. And you can pick out pockets, and there's some great writers, and there's some pockets of things there. But just as a whole, it was a very, very bad time. As you get to the end of it, it definitely begins to change as we come out of the Dark Ages. But this fall of the western side of Rome, it just devastated Europe. It threw it into chaos and anarchy, death, no safety anywhere. So very, very bad time. So, okay, so devastating to Rome. Devastating to Western Europe. The second thing to mention is some reasons why the Roman Empire fell. We looked at some reasons why we have the Republic collapsing and changing. Now, why did the empire collapse? And a lot of the things parallel. I'll just have it listed here as 3 different things. There's whole books written about this, but just 3 different things. The first one is political weakness. We see with the empire in time, the political structure becoming very unstable. With Diocletian here, duct tapes the thing together a little bit. But under the barracks emperors, so a lot of political weakness. And lots of it, not just the emperor, often all the way down the line, inefficiency. So, okay, another problem was economic decline. Rome had for hundreds of years lived off of welfare. The individual people had, but Rome itself, the city and the government structure, they were continually conquering new territories and making them pay tribute. And as they began to lose these territories and no longer get the tribute, all of a sudden they didn't have the money coming in. So we have the economic struggle that produced. And then the third one, the one we mentioned before really with the Republic, was a loss of character and the family. We mentioned before that the damage that the welfare system did, that damage continues on. Okay, last thing for Rome is some important things that we get out of Rome. Some things we should make sure we learn. So, all right, the first one, we get the Romance languages out of Rome. I just have some important things to remember about Rome. So, they didn't come up anywhere else in the lecture, so I stuck them in here. The Romance languages, anybody know what we mean by Romance? Nothing about the snack shop, please. Yeah, based off of Latin. They come very closely out of Latin. They're referred to as the Romance languages. Spanish, Portuguese, French, Italian, and Romanian. So even, what's that? Oh, even English has a lot of Latin in it. Anybody ever take Latin? One? Okay. You're from Utah. Pastor Malinax. Yeah, he's one of those crazy people. How many years? 8? Oh, you are crazy. I took 2 years, and that was enough. But you know more than me. There are a lot of Latin roots. A lot of our roots of our words have Latin origins. Wasn't you that was trying to remember what Mare Nostrum meant? Okay. After 8 years? Come on. All right, Romance languages. So a lot of the modern languages of the world come directly out of Latin. So Romance languages. So, okay, another thing to remember about Rome is their legal system. They have, they kept, especially going back to the Roman Republic. There's a lot to look at and copy about their legal system. Everything being written down, a uniform code, a uniform treatment of people. Even Paul. I'm a citizen. You can't do this to me. And all of a sudden, we can't. That legal structure gets copied, and even our founding fathers harken back to Rome for that. So, all right. One other thing we need to mention is Christianity. We also get Christianity out of Rome. It'd be hard to forget that one, I hope. Christ was born here, died here. They persecute Christians for a long time. And then Christianity becomes legal, and that actually does a lot of damage to Christianity. I don't know if we talked about that at all with the Edict of Milan. Did we mention that at all? So anyway, it does great damage when it's made legal. There's no cost associated anymore. And especially when it became the fad and became popular to be a Christian. You get all kinds of people joining the church that care nothing about Christ. And that really is at the heart of how we get the Catholic Church. It's that perversion of Christianity that comes after it becomes legal. So Christianity comes out of Rome. Okay, questions about Rome? I may know the answers. Caleb looks like he wants to ask something. But
Did the Romans ever beat Obelix and Asterix?
do what?
Did the Romans ever beat Obelix and Asterix?
I don't know. Is that the knot? Or what are we talking about? No.
It's a cartoon series from Europe, I believe. It's a cartoon series from Europe, I believe. So I think you made a good joke there.
Okay, I missed it completely. Sorry. All right, any other questions? All right, let's talk about the Middle Ages. We got about 15 minutes. Let's see if we can cover 1,000 years of history right here. All right, we're just going to look at a couple of things. Well, three. Guess it's not a couple. A few things here from the Middle Ages. The first is the Catholic Church. We already mentioned that Rome's collapse led to the start of the Dark Ages, or the Middle Ages, threw it into chaos and disorder. This might be a little bit oversimplification, but in a lot of ways, the Catholic Church froze it. It preserved the chaos and disorder and ignorance that was there. All right, just this morning, did you guys hear about there's a 12 or 13-year-old kid that made a digital clock by hand and brought it to school in a suitcase, and they arrested him, and they thought he made a bomb. Okay. Anyway, somebody called in and said, yeah, there was a guy way back in history that played around with curved glass and claimed he could magnify things, and the Catholic Church got really upset with him. Galileo. The Catholic Church was very much against, in a lot of ways, they preserved the ignorance that existed there through the years. I think we've thrown common sense out the window. Kid's bragging about the clock that he made. He didn't go to Walmart and buy it. I mean, I assume he bought the components and assembled them together, and it actually worked and kept time. And the teacher takes him to the principal's office, and they call the police and the FBI, whoever. They think it's a bomb, and he's going to blow the school building up. Can you imagine the blow that was to the kid? Instead of the teacher saying, wow, that's amazing. Haul him off to jail and claim he's a terrorist. All right, how do we get to that? The Catholic Church here, they did a lot to preserve the ignorance that was there in the Middle Ages. You might be thinking, well, how do they have so much sway and so much authority? The reason for that was through salvation. The Catholic Church claimed and convinced everybody that you had to be part of the church in order to go to heaven. And that gave them lots and lots of power. Imagine if Pastor Dameron convinced you that in order to get saved, you had to be a member of this church. If you weren't a member of Fairhaven Baptist Church, you could not go to heaven. And Pastor Dameron got up and said, if you ever wear a brown V-neck sweater, we're going to kick you out of the church. You're leaving? You're saying, oh, hell's worth it. Give me my sweater. No, if you really believed that he controlled heaven or hell, it would give him tremendous power. And that's the position the Catholic Church was in. They controlled heaven and hell in everybody's mind. So if the church threatened to kick you out, that was a very, very bad thing, because that meant there was no hope of heaven. All right, so salvation was through the church. You had to be part of the church, be a member of the church, partake in the sacraments, and go to confession, all that good stuff. Or there was no hope of heaven. All right, that right there is at the heart of why they had so much power. Okay. In time, we see that power weakening as we get towards the end of the Middle Ages. Anybody know? This is a very broad question. What contributed to that facet of the Catholic Church being weakened? The idea that people believed you had to be part of the Catholic Church to be saved. That's a very, very broad question, but what do you think? What contributed to that? Why don't you believe that? Yeah, the Bible. As people got the Bible, the Catholic Church was very, very adamant about people not having the Bible. In fact, they killed people that tried to spread the Bible. They were very adamant against it. And as we get the Bible written in the language of the common people, people could read it. Right? That's when we get to the Reformation and the power of the Catholic Church being broken. People began to realize that it was wrong. But without that, they were able to convince masses of people that salvation was through them. And it gave them a tremendous amount of power, even at times telling kings what was going to happen and not happen. So, tremendous amount of power. So the Catholic Church, a very dominant player here through the Middle Ages, and that one piece is at the heart of where that power came from. Again, there's other factors involved, but that is a very important piece. So, all right, the second thing I want to talk about is the main government structure of the Middle Ages. It's called feudalism. Feudal. Every year, at least one person tells me about feutilism. Okay, that's a different thing. Feudalism, Feudal, feudalism. All right, this is described lots of different ways. In some reasons, in some senses, it's a little bit hard to describe because there's lots of variation throughout Western Europe as to how this worked. But basically, feudalism is a hierarchical structure where, as you get higher up the ladder, people have more and more authority. And the guy at the top technically owned everything in the structure. So if we had Indiana with a feudal state, the governor of Indiana would technically own the whole state. And he would partition it out to people underneath him and maybe give Michael Santucci, whatever. Michael with his tuba. Give him Northwest Indiana, and it would be his to control. He would have to answer to the governor for certain things, but he pretty much was on his own inside this area. And he would look at Northwest Indiana and say, well, this is too much. I need some help. And maybe he'd get Beth Lee and give her a hunk of it. Well, your sister too. We'll let her play. How could I do that? She was my high school student. Morgan, Beth Lee, and John. All three get pieces. And he would give them a piece of land underneath him. And they would rule that pretty much as they wanted. Technically, he still owned the land, sort of, because the governor technically owned his land. But we have this hierarchical structure where the king owns everything, and the land gets partitioned off to people below him, and they partition off to people below them. And it eventually gets down to just one lousy, poor little guy like Jacob, who has enough land to keep himself afloat. All right, himself afloat as a nobleman. There would be peasants and serfs who worked the land for him, and he would sit at home, pretty much like he does now, and demand things of people. Hopefully your sister at some point smacks you several times across the face. But it would work down to just one guy with enough land to keep himself afloat. All right, so I don't know if that hierarchical structure is a very, it's not a very good term for it, but it's the best one I know of. Okay, so we have the hierarchical structure. Another important facet of feudalism is that at the heart of this whole structure was military strength. Did we pick a governor yet for the state? We had Duke Michael. No, you got kicked out of the church. At the heart of this thing was military strength. If it ever got to the point that Michael felt he could take the governor out, he would typically try, right? And then he would be the king. All right, so this military strength was at the heart of it. All right, there were vows, and they would talk about their loyalty to the king above them and his obligations to the people below them, their vassals. But often those things went out the window when they saw a chance to kill the king and make themselves the king. Right? So military strength was at the heart of it. Now again, as you go through this towards the end of the Middle Ages, this system shifts a whole lot, and we get much more of what we think of as a monarch, a real king at the top, as opposed to this hierarchical structure, but that happens over several hundred years. So the dominant government structure is this feudal system. Yeah.
I'm sorry. Did you give me time period for the Middle Ages?
500 to 1500. call Morgan by the right name to make up. Okay, the last thing to mention here from the Middle Ages is the Crusades. The Crusades. All right, like the Peloponnesian War there, hopefully you think Civil War. For the Crusades, you should think military campaigns. They were military campaigns. There are some details there, but they were, at the heart, they were military campaigns. All right, 8:14. That'll work. All right, these are military campaigns organized by the Catholic Church against the Muslims in the Holy Lands. The Muslims had taken over the Holy Lands. Yeah, this will work. Okay, yeah, 1140 is the time for this. The Muslims had come through and taken over this entire area. They had not, by the time of the Crusades, yet completely destroyed the Byzantine Empire. It's still here. But all of this was taken over by the Muslims. And the Catholic Church here, shortly after this, organizes these military campaigns to go back and take over the Holy Land. So, Catholics had, prior to these invasions, these crusades, had gone there and visited all the holy sites in Jerusalem and built churches and all kinds of stuff. There was a shift with the Muslims, and they began to be very aggressive towards these people and began to persecute them and not give them much freedom to visit all the holy sites. That was the excuse for the Catholic Church to organize these military campaigns. They wanted to free the Holy Land so that all the Catholics could go there freely and visit all of the holy sites. I'm thinking of a couple of rabbit trails, but let's stay off of those. So, all right, the first one of these was organized in 1095. Or, yeah, 1095. What I think 1096 is on our timeline. 1096 is when they actually left. The Pope begins to call for this thing in 1095. It's called the First Crusade. And it goes to the Holy Land and conquers some territory. These pieces of land, the Kingdom of Jerusalem, the Principality of Antioch, these things right here were conquered in this First Crusade, and they set up government structures. They're Catholic rulers. A lot of the knights who led these things become major players in the government structure in these things. They set up a feudal system, basically, like they had in Europe. All right, so from about 1096, we see the Catholics here controlling hunks of land here in the Middle East, and they control that land to the end of the Crusades in our timeline, 1291. That was when the Muslims take back all of this land from them. It left in 1096. I don't actually have it was just a couple of years, it wasn't real long. After that First Crusade, there were multiple other crusades. The Second Crusade, the Third Crusade. We have Richard the Lionhearted against Saladin and some famous incidences there. Think Robin Hood with Richard the Lionhearted. He leaves England. We have Robin Hood there. There was a children's crusade. Anybody know anything about that one? It's funny and sad. It's like Caleb's acting like anybody else. Just a couple. You want to tell us about it, or? They never made it. Yeah, this guy, I don't have the name here. Some kid had this vision that God was going to part the Mediterranean for them, and they could walk across to the Holy Land. So he gets all these kids. I can't remember his name. They get down to the coast, and the water doesn't part. And a group of merchants say, "Oh, we'll help you. We'll give you a free ride over." They load the kids up and sell them as slaves. That's the end of it. One of them, about 20 years later, one of them escaped and made it back. Nobody in Europe really knew what happened. They just disappeared and never heard from them again, but sold them as slaves. There was that one. There was a peasants' crusade. Most of the other ones, it was just the Jacobs of the world, the nobility on these things. Wow. It was a dark time, wasn't it? We refer to Jacob as noble. Most of the nobility. There was a peasants' crusade. and they get slaughtered by the Muslims, very ugly. I don't have all the numbers with me. The third or fourth crusade, I think it's the fourth crusade, they were run out of money, so they needed help getting across. So some merchants in Venice, I believe it is, said, we'll give you a free passage over as long as you help us with one of our arch rivals in trade, Constantinople. So they took them there and they sacked Constantinople. So something get a little bit sidetracked. Crusades. The first one is successful in the sense of it did conquer land and drive the Muslims out in that. So, okay, before we leave the Crusades, I have here some results of the Crusades. We're not so much concerned about being able to list all the Crusades and who did what. They're military campaigns against the Muslims in the Holy Lands. Some results of this. There were some important things. First of all, there was an exchange of ideas. We had people in Europe, in Western Europe, who were in the middle of the Dark Ages, a very ignorant time, all right? And they travel to the Middle East and they get exposed to cultures and knowledge and the Byzantines and all that they had, just a whole world of things that they never knew existed or even thought about. So we have this, this exchange of ideas, mostly ideas from the Byzantine Empire and the Middle East going back to Europe, reawakening a lot of their thinking and knowledge. Okay, we have the exchange of ideas. We have an exchange of goods. It's popular today to only buy local goods. Nobody ever sees, locally made or something. If you ever really want to do that, it's going to be really expensive, and you're going to have a very limited selection. All right, very limited selection. I think if you only lived on things grown in Northwest Indiana, hope you like corn and pigs. Very limited selection. The Europe, for the most part, they lived on only locally grown things. Had very limited selection. That's part of why they died at 37 in France, because they didn't have anything from outside. And these people travel, and all of a sudden they're exposed to fruits and all kinds of things that they couldn't have in Europe. And they get back to Europe, and they still want these things. All right, so it sets up this desire for Europeans to have these products that they got while they're on the Crusades. Now that plays in a very important role developing trade in time. We will hit that later. So exchange of goods. The people get back to England, and they don't want to eat the same junk that they've always had. They want the stuff they had on the Crusades. And there were some very innovative people who are willing to supply those things for a small markup. The free market steps in and sets that up. So, all right, and then the last thing is a modification of the feudal structure. Modification of the feudal structure. This happens, a couple of different things here come out of this, but if you just have that'll be sufficient. But part of the reason for the modification is a lot of the nobles get killed. What a pleasant thought. Jacob dies. The nobles get killed. So we have the king back home, and a lot of the pieces of his structure all of a sudden are dead. So in many cases, he would just take over directly. Right, so we have modification that way. Another modification that comes along, and it ties in with the trade and the exchange of goods, is lots of cities begin to develop. Now, lots of cities. Cities that are outside the feudal structure. The people that began to trade and bring in these products, they would establish themselves on the coast or someplace and build some structures and eventually a city. And it didn't belong to any nobleman. It was kind of outside the whole structure. So we get these cities that are kind of their own independent pocket. They live by different rules. In time, the kings began to encourage these cities because they would tax the merchants wanting to come there. But we have these cities developing that are completely outside the feudal structure. So the point is, a modification of feudalism comes out of these crusades. So there's other results we can list, but I think those are important ones. I mean, there's military advancements and new designs and techniques, but that's all right. All right, any questions? I know Stephanie wants to go through all the military things. All right, we will pick it up Monday morning.